All right, today we're going to talk about a packing method where I was trained, it was referred to as guillotine style packing. It's also probably more generically referred to as contour brace systems, or sometimes they call them yoke systems. Basically it consists of braces that form a plane, almost always horizontal, that are cut in two pieces, a two-piece system, that you capture the front and the back between them. The materials you use depend to some degree on the weight of the piece and the context you're using it in. Meaning whether there's a difference between if you're doing it to where your box is the primary box, it's what's traveling as is, or if it's an inner container. In the one, you're cushioning around the object, with that being its only cushioning. If you're doing an inner box, then you're focusing less on cushioning, or actually sometimes the opposite, and doing your cushioning between the inner container and the outer container. Also, it can be used in a bunch of different circumstances, though, too. It's also not just a crating thing. It can be very handy in like lighter weight inner boxes, and even as a hold down method. The one thing that they tend to have in common are a channel that the brace slides in. In this case, I only have a bottom channel because I'm going to do two different kinds of braces. I'm going to do the ethafoam, which is probably the more common, and I'm going to do a plywood version. The first thing I'm going to do, though, is talk about how we're placing the object before I talk about the specifics of both finding the form and cutting the guillotines and covering the surfaces and all that sort of good stuff. What you're looking at right now is how a lot of beginning crate people would tend to do. There's a real mindset that you have to avoid when you're dealing with three-dimensional objects, which is to look at something that's artificially determined, like a base. So often people will tend to measure from the base or place the object based on the base. And in this case we can see it's like that throws the whole thing pretty much off center. Right now it's like, oh, I'm spacing this all evenly, front to back and side to side. But that kind of pushes the object over. It also throws it off balance a little bit as well. So we need to make sure we get out of that mindset and be looking at what we're doing. You have to start thinking, when you look at it, how am I going to hold it? What points am I going to contact? And what do I need to avoid? And in this case, this desire to have things be, kind of rectilinear and parallel is going to hurt us, because in this situation here, I don't have anything as this top brace comes across here. I don't have anything on this side I really can touch. This hand is projecting. I don't want to put pressure on that to hold it. That would be kind of nuts. There's a good chance this could be broken and repaired. You couldn't even tell. So we want to figure, well, what can I touch and how do I get to it? In this case, it's a relatively simple thing, and this is a relatively simple form. All you need to do is rotate the piece. And there, all of a sudden, I have access to this shoulder. So my brace can come in and contact it here and over here, and then of course it'll be matching on the back side. We'll do the same thing down here. We'll have contact points here and here, and avoid this hand pretty much entirely. The only exception might be if it's really loose. Sometimes you might want to lock all of this in, but that's kind of the extreme end of the plywood version of this method. The next thing you're going to see is I have been sent out on site before with one of these cut in half. It's like, well, it's a two-piece system, right? So here's half, here's half. Well, unfortunately, that can be pretty detrimental, in the sense that unless you're packing a perfectly symmetrical object, you're going to kind of miss the boat on this. Instead of starting out with our pieces cut here, we're going to adjust them to actually fit the object we're dealing with. Imagine that. So as I pointed out, we came down and realized that it was going to be 9 1/4 inches to the center of this, to the center of the contact point, that is right where we want it. And then we want to figure out how far in we're coming, which looks like about 4 3/8 inches in. Which will put us right there. This side, the other side, stepping across, we came forward 6 inches, as I recall. So here are our 2 points that we want to start out with. That we determined by measuring up there. And then we're just going to make it be flat this way. And if you don't want to mark it exactly this way, you could have just been cutting that, obviously, and not marking it. In this case, I think it's useful, though, to actually mark it out. So those are going to be the 2 pieces. The thing that you notice is it's a little off-center this way. This is not equal to this. That's actually really groovy because you got to remember that we've got, in the back, we're quite flat, and in the front, we're projecting out. So that actually represents, you know, the piece as we know it to be if we think about it. Don't get caught up in aesthetics of your brace. All right, so here we've got our 2 pieces that are our starting blanks. And this, basically, we're going to use to cut out the pieces that we need to slide this back and contact the actual sculpture. One thing that we're not going to do, though, is if this is how we want it to end up, this is not how we're going to cut it. And this makes sense if you think about it. In fact, we want to cut the back side first. So the usefulness of the base, in this case, is going to be just so we can spin it around and have it in basically the same location, only inverted. So I'm going to measure these points here, and then I'm going to spin it around, and we'll start on the back. Okay, so here we have the piece reversed. At this point, I would point out a couple things. Normally, if you're doing a side, you do all your braces, you know, on one side while it's in one place. And starting out with a front facing was good for illustrative purposes, but generally what that was to tell you is that when you go to set this up, you want to set it up with the back facing you first. That said, here we'll go ahead and do some form finding. There's a variety of different ways to find forms for contour packing. It's like kind of the thing that is intimidating about this. There are folks who use wire and will go in and bend it and get it to try and keep the shape of the piece, and then transfer that over to the foam, or sometimes to a piece of cardboard. There are woodworkers have contour gauges that have a series of little plastic fingers that you can put up against like molding. That can be good for some small things. Frankly, that's not big enough to do what we normally want. And then also there are gauges that are homemade gauges that utilize coroplast with a bunch of thin rods that function in the same way, only on a larger scale. The problem with all of them is that if you find this form, you can get that accurately, but then you have to get it on something going this way, and getting it at just the right angle is tough. You almost have to put it in there with a sheet that's already locked in here as a reference point. So sometimes you get that form, cut it out of a piece of cardboard, slide another piece of cardboard in this slot, and then you can just shoot a couple dabs of glue and match the two. When you put them together, they'll be the exact shape of your bracket. The more down and dirty way to do this, that is, works pretty well, I think, actually, is to use some scrap foam that hopefully you have anyway. And we're going to make a little tool to help us do it in place, with the brace in place. But basically what I want to do is this thing, to be where I want it, it needs to go in exactly this much. That much is a known. So right there that is going to determine how deep my cut needs to be at its deepest point, which is right back here off this shoulder. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to cut it maybe a hair long, because what I'll do is I'll make a little notch, and that's right where my pencil, my Sharpie or whatever I'm using is going to go. I'll help hold it in place, and then I'm going to cut the front of this to a point, making sure not to make it any shorter. And then I'm going to use that and move it along the surface of the piece, making sure that I maintain contact with where I want it to cut, and that I keep this this perpendicular so it accurately reflects the contour. The temptation can be to like rotate this way as you go around the shape of it, and then you lose the cut, because basically this needs to go straight in. All right, so I'm basically on this outside surface, and I'm going to slowly move this along and let the pointer contact right with the edge of the object. Trying to keep this point straight out from that point as much as is possible. So that should basically line up with wherever the shoulder goes. So now I'll take this and cut it with a knife. Alright, so here I've taken the outline that I made using the little guide and just cut a straight cut, because I measured at the top part of this contour. It slopes out a little bit, so that's what you want. You want the furthest in on a given surface. So when I go to put this in here, it's going to come up, and it'll be, when you press it up, about 5/8 of an inch gap between here and the actual surface on the top, because of the angle and out here. So this depth here tells you how much you need to cut off on this other side. And if you want to, you can, just as a reference point, come down here and confirm your marks, because it may not be consistent. So basically I need to make cuts that go in here at that angle. All right, now that I've cut this back, I've rounded off this edge, so it's going to be nice and sweet. It goes in there and we've got the contact we want. We can at this point, if we're going to cover the area with some kind of surface contact material, we do that now. But the other side of it is we may want to go a little bit further and take it to the next level, in which case we can add more foam here if there's something that we feel like isn't getting adequate support. We can come in underneath. We could even go on edge if we want to, as long as it's cut flush with the back of this. And then, or we can go up top and broaden it out by applying, extra foam here and basically gain a lot more surface area. Just depends on the piece, the material, etc. So that went pretty smoothly. Strangely enough, that was pretty much, you're not going to get too much quicker than that. It's basically 2 cuts. Don't figure that's going to happen. It doesn't normally happen with me either. You have to fine tune typically. Sometimes you can make bigger boo-boos though, and that's where a couple things come in, and one that I mentioned earlier. Here's a blank that basically fits the idea of the crate. Just to be sane, always have an extra 1 or 2 of these. If you bring them, then you won't need them. If you don't have them, you will mess yourself up. But another thing you can do in this case is get blanks that are longer and fit the width. The reason for that is if you do have a miscut, and you go, oh man, and you need to cut some more, and all of a sudden this starts sinking inside of the crate, it's like you're not stuck trying to scab little strips on there or do whatever. Instead, you can just keep carving, hopefully not too long, but keep carving until you've got your fit. And when that is where you want it, then basically you get it exactly lined up. You do this, you make a mark, you make a cut, and this is perfectly lined up for the back side. Okay, so we cut our basic foam kind of contour braces earlier. Here is an example of up where I don't even want to touch the projection, so I'm just contacting this back surface area. And where we're contacting our sculpture, we have a couple options. One being just the tie back that's tucked in here. That's kind of a good thing. You can mess around a little bit underneath there, and since you're covering it up, if you have to add some material back where you carve too much, that's very doable. Another option, if you are pretty dead on, which does happen occasionally, and you feel really good about your fit, you can always go in and do a heat weld thing, which looks quite nice. It's just a matter of using your heat gun, and you have an extra wide strip, and start in the middle and just heat it and push it in place and work your way out. Then it'll be sticking out, and you just trim it. And so that's one thing that can be a nice thing, gives a nice finished look. So those are a couple of the basic things for foam guillotines.